I'm Maria Piacentini and I'm the Associate Dean for Research. I'm really delighted to welcome you all here today and my wonderful colleague, Hilary, for her professorial inaugural lecture. Claire would have been here today, but for various personal reasons, she's not in the UK at the moment, or in England. So what I just wanted to say by way of introduction to what we're doing here, obviously we're a leading business and management school, and it's really important to us that we're engaging with issues of societal importance. We want to celebrate the successes of all our colleagues, and this series, and this is the last one in the series, is about our newest professors in the faculty and hearing about their work and just having an opportunity to bring their research to a wider audience. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here with Hilary, who I work closely with in other ways, but not on research. So I did a little bit of digging around about Hilary beforehand, so I didn't realise you'd a Scottish connection. You'd studied at Glasgow and at Strathclyde, but you did your undergraduate in economics and econometrics at Loughborough, then your master's at Manchester, and you worked for the government as a statistician, and then you got your PhD at Glasgow, so that's really great. And you joined us here at Lancaster in 1996 and has taken on very many important roles. And in 2022, you became professor. And you took on your current role as head of department last year, or 2023. Yep. So thank you for that. So for those of you who know Hilary, you'll know her work spans a wide range of applied topics. You've been working on flexible labour markets in Europe, examining the success of various short-term working schemes, etc. Hilary publishes her work in leading journals in economics and in business and management. And the other thing about Hilary is she's one of our most visible and engaged scholars in the management school. And you frequently turn on the radio or turn on the TV in the morning, you see Hilary standing in a food bank or something similar, grinning and talking about the great work that she does. So we're absolutely delighted to celebrate you here today. And we're going to listen to your presentation, The Accidental Academic.
Thank you very much, Maria. And thank you for everybody that's here, either online, and particularly grateful to my colleagues for turning up in person. And Kath, I really did think you did yours in a room. So that is why I did it. So obviously I've got the sort of short straw here because I'm going last. So, you know, everybody else has gone before me and told you all about their great work, and now I've somehow got to follow that. I've also got an absolutely dreadful cough, so I've got medication as well. Of course, the real bonus of this is not necessarily the lecture, but as Renaud reminded me this morning, it's the framed certificate that Kath has in her office, which actually means I've collected all three, because not only will I have this one, I have the 25-year one, and I have a Dean's Award one for COVID. So, complete set. But in actual fact, I've got four, because when we got our 25-year awards, and I went along with Vicky and with Steve from Accounting and Finance, after the event, somebody emailed and said the paper was very poor quality. So they gave us another one. So if you want more, just complain about the paper. Right, so basically what this is, it's a sort of a bit of a story about what I've done. Maria has told you some of it. Most of it, or a lot of what's happened, has been quite accidental. So you never know where you're going to end up, do you? Charles Carter. That was it. Right, okay, so as most of you all know, most of the graphics in this have been done by ChatGPT. Right, so this is where, in a sense, my journey begins. So this is the first accident. And I think it's fair to say that this was 100% my own fault and nobody else's. So I grew up in Plymouth, which was quite hilly in parts. And my parents' house was on a bit of a slope. So there were sort of steps to get up to the front door. So we didn't have iPads, had to make our own amusement. So one thing that seemed a good idea was jumping off these steps until you got to the very top one. I went to the top one first, jumped off, landed on my arm, splat. So I stood up. There I am in my school shirt, all red down the arm with a bone poking through. So I go in, my mum and dad are having their tea, as we called it. I said, excuse me, I think I've broken my arm. My mother said, go back outside and play, dear. Anyway, she looked at my shirt and freaked out. So, long story short, I was in hospital for months and months on end. I ripped all of the nerves, couldn't move my fingers, all of it scary at the time. So when I came out, my parents were told three things. The first one, which is here, they told that I should get a top of the range Lego set because you have to pull the bricks, make houses, make whatever else. Now, I never managed that. All I managed was a sort of rectangular thing, but it was quite useful for sort of exercise. The second thing I got, which I've not got a picture of, was one of those little machines that had mini chocolate bars, and you could put in a coin and you had to turn a handle and out came a small bar of chocolate. But that handle was quite hard. So I stuffed myself with small chocolate bars. But that wasn't really the most important. The most important thing that I actually got was this, which probably doesn't look very exciting. That's not me. Right, a tennis racket. So essentially, with tennis, you've got to grip the racket. It actually takes quite a bit of strength. So age 6, I think I was, I got the tennis racket and I got private tennis lessons. And that really was it. That was my life taken over. So I was going to be a professional tennis player. Job done. So basically, I came home from school, dumped everything, ran to the tennis club, did homework on the bus the next morning. And I did that probably for about 10 years. And there were 3 of us that were playing at the same time. The other 2 were slightly more successful. So my doubles partner won Junior Wimbledon. She was rather clever as well because she went on to read medicine at Cambridge. The other one actually won the British Under-21 Championships. So what went wrong for me? Well, I don't know if you recognise this person. Anybody know who it is? Yeah, it's Eva Swiatek, former world #1, who demolished Emma Raducanu yesterday in Paris. So, you know, that was going to be me. There is, however, a slight problem. You may or may not know, but Eva Swiatek is 5'9", or in European terms, 1.76 m. I am 1.63 m or 5'4". So clearly this was going to be a bit problematic. Also, there is actually a tennis player now called Jasmine Paolini, who's exactly the same height as me, but she runs very fast and I don't. So that was sort of plan A, if you like. Right, so I suppose aged about 15, 16, you know, what am I going to do with my life? So my cousin's husband was sent to talk to me, I think. He was a major in the army, so he had me signing up for the army, and I didn't much fancy that either. So I decided to look around. So I looked around, and at the time, all I wanted to do was to leave school. I went to a very upmarket, all-girls school where we wore 3-cornered hats. It was bizarre. So how could I leave? So I worked out that the best way to leave was to declare to my parents an undying love for economics, because the school did not teach economics A-level, which, as we know from Discover Economics, is still the case in a lot of schools. So along I go. I really, really want to do this. I really must. And the reason I wanted to do it was you could do it at the sixth form college, which looked a lot more appealing than our school did. So all was set. However, unbeknown to me, my parents must have visited the headmistress of the school, because the next thing I discover is that, lo and behold, the school have arranged me to take economics GCSE and A-level at the local boys' school. The embarrassment was just too much. It was, I could have died. Now, you know, believe me, the last thing a 16-year-old girl wants to do is to spend 2 hours, 5 days a week, sat with a group of boys. That is a scene from an Alan Bennett play. The play is actually called The History Boys. It's actually very good. James Corden and Dominic Cooper in the film. So there we go. That's, you know, so that's why economics really, total accident or my own fault. Okay, so I do that. I actually find it's quite good. So can't really think what to do. So I thought, right, go to university. So where do I go? Well, I still like playing tennis. So I go to what is now one of our competitors, Loughborough, because, you know, sports facilities were second to none, had a room overlooking a running track, and all was good. So it was great. So I played a lot of sport, did a bit of work every now and then. And again, what would I do next? So I went and did a master's degree at Manchester. So I decided when I went there, I didn't really want to do so much economics, because just to write essays, that seemed like hard work. So I just did a master's degree in econometrics. It was a bit drier than actually anticipated. 75% econometrics, a bit of mathematical economics thrown in for light relief. And I think there were 6 of us on the whole degree. I think Ian was there at the time when I did that. No, because we didn't go to your department, did we? We weren't allowed to, because when I first went, my plan was to do half economics and half econometric, but they said, oh no, you've got to stay in the econometrics department. So I did that. After that, I decided, okay, get a job. So I went through the civil service procedure, and I got a job in what was then the Department of Trade and Industry. It was near Victoria. The most interesting thing about the office was it overlooked Horseferry Magistrates Court. And for those of you that know, anybody that does anything wrong in central London over the weekend ends up in Horseferry Magistrates Court on a Monday morning. Lots of famous people have been through there. Right, so we had this little division, and we were responsible for the index of production for the chemical industry, which is just as exciting as it sounds. And every week we had all of these chemical trade magazines sort of delivered, and it was sort of very, very hierarchical. So we had a whole team of executive officers, then we had a whole team of sort of administrative people. Then there was me, I was the assistant statistician, and then there was a guy at the top, the statistician, David, he was called. So basically all we did, we worked all week to produce a single number, like 101.2 or 101.4. And it was my job to take this number to David. And it was just unbelievable, because all this work had gone all month for this one number. And then if he didn't like it, he changed it. So I would take it in, and he said, we can't publish that. The phones will never stop ringing. So we'd done it basically for not very much at all. So, you know, when you're working with official government statistics, just be a bit wary. They're not all what they're cracked up to be. Right, so I stayed there for a bit. And then eventually I left. Why did I leave? It's not very easy, as I decided I was going to live in Hampstead. on a junior civil service salary. So basically, central London, it was so expensive. I went to Warwick, as everybody goes through Warwick at some stage. So if anybody's not been there yet, your time will come. Right, so the first thing I started working on was mergers and acquisitions. And the sad lesson in life is that one of the first papers I did, which was actually based on a survey of managers, was done with 2 students. It was in the Journal of Management Studies, and it's the most cited thing I've ever had. And people still write to me and ask if I've got the data. Anyway, so essentially what I did with this, the sort of things I did. So this survey was all about why do managers keep actually engaging in mergers and acquisitions? Because if you look at all of the evidence, the only people that win are the shareholders of the acquired company. And they win more if it's a contested bid, because they push the price up, they gain. And the acquirer, the shareholders there, typically don't see very much. If anything, more often than not, they see a loss. And there's all sorts of reasons put forward for this. And in fact, Carey Cooper, that was here, that a lot of you will know, a lot of it is about you can't just force 2 institutions together and expect that it will work. You've got, on the one side, you've got different cultures. On a purely practical side, you can't just merge computer systems and everything. So that is why that tends not to necessarily be a success. But what we did find out, or what it would appear, and there was an article on hubris that was published years and years ago, is that most managers actually go into these things with the best of intentions, but that it doesn't quite work out. And of course, if you look at a lot of even chief executives, in terms of these big takeovers, they don't get to do many. They might only do 1 or 2 while they're in post. The other thing that I moved on to, which some of you won't be so familiar with, is I looked at the case of banks and building societies. So building societies in the UK, the Marsden is one. They're like US savings and loans. So we looked at, there were a lot of mergers in this sector and a lot of deregulation. And then I also looked at executive compensation. And in terms of banks and building societies, basically, the bigger it is, the more you will earn. It doesn't necessarily matter how well you perform. Finally, in that area, I did some work on technological adoption in financial services, because that was quite rapid at the time. So this was fairly successful. The ESRC paid for a lot of it. Lever Hume paid for some. Afield paid for some. So I thought Maria was going. So that was sort of one strand of what I did. Right, the next thing that I did was a lot of work on Poland in particular, Eastern Europe and the EU. And Kath knows about this because she was at the other end of some of it when she worked at DFID. Right, so that's a picture of Warsaw. This is the Palace of Culture and Science. It was a gift from the Soviet Union. So the argument is the best place to see this is from inside, because it's the only place you can't actually see the building. It is absolutely huge. There's a university in there. There's all sorts of stuff. But it actually looks better in the picture than it does in real life. Right, so essentially, what did I look at? Well, the things I looked at were like mainly the labour market in particular. So the labour market under state socialism was very, very odd. There were all sorts of odd things about state socialism. So even if you look at education, in universities, the teaching of sociology was barred. You weren't allowed to teach it. End of. And if you look at the labour market, it was a very odd system. So where do you think the highest paid people were? Mining. Yeah, so. Huh?
Socialism, paid the same.
No, they weren't. So the high wages were in the physical industries, and the best paid was mining. And of course, women weren't allowed to work in mining. Women were dominant in accounting, but accountants got paid very little. So it was a sort of menial type task. So of course, all this changed very much. And then also in Poland, they were the first country to have the majority of medical students who were female. So there was an awful lot sort of went on there. So this was about how things, if you like, readjusted to what we would see as a more normal economic system. And in particular, agriculture was a big peculiarity, because even during state socialism, agriculture was still in private hands. So you had, particularly down the east of the country, you had a lot of family farms, and these people were particularly disadvantaged because if you had any connection to a family farm, you were not entitled to any social security. So there was a lot going on here. The regional problems were huge. So somewhere like Warsaw quickly actually moved towards what you might recognize as a Western city. But a lot of other parts of the country really didn't change very much at all. And of course, Poland was an odd country insofar that after the Second World War, it actually moved. So what happened was, so that the Polish border with Germany, that, I'm not very good at geography, that moved west because Germany lost territory and it was given to Poland. And then the same happened on the eastern border with Russia because Poland gave up territory, which was given to Russia for their support during the war. So it literally did move. And I did quite a bit of work on spatial autocorrelation with that, which was quite interesting. The other thing that I did about Poland, because Poland was the one that was always in the news, really, it's the biggest of the CE states, was I looked at actual strikes. Because the thing about unions, particularly in Poland, first of all, if you were a union member, and they weren't the same sort of unions you saw in the West, but you got things like childcare, lots of other benefits. And of course, most of you are too young to remember, but of course, in the Polish case, solidarity was the factor really that saw the overthrow of the old regime, because Lech Walesa became the first president. And so I did some work basically on who actually was in a union in Poland. It's not surprising, tended to be older workers, tended to be ones that were still in state-owned enterprise. And in particular, it was regional. So Malopolska, which is in the southeast. I don't know if anybody's been, it's a bit grim, but it's home to the Nowa Huta, used to be called the Lenin Steelworks. Now, in some ways, the strikes work a bit historical now, but it's proved quite useful because, as Maria said, I do get to do some media things. And one of the things that's paid big dividends is actually people going on strike. So when the doctors were on strike, when the teachers were on strike, when the train drivers were on strike, I actually got quite a lot of interviews, and looking at the newspaper, they might be about to do the same again. So maybe there might be some more engagement coming along there. Another thing, again, relating to Eastern Europe, but not exclusively, is I have done and I'm still doing some work on financial development and growth. So, you know, there's one argument that you need finance for economies to grow. There's another argument you can have too much and the relationship reverses. So what I've been looking at is essentially the IMF have got a fairly new measure of financial development. So it looks at two things. It looks at financial markets and financial institutions. And it looks for both of those, it looks at their depth, their access, and their efficiency. And in general, there is support for a positive relationship, but it's much, much stronger in emerging economies. So basically for the West, the finance isn't a problem anymore. Most of what is required is there. In emerging economies, it's still an important thing because most of these economies have very poorly developed stock markets. They don't trade many shares. And then the other thing I wanted to look at was actual the effect of democracy. And if you look at lower income countries, not just in emerging economies, lower income countries in general, then democracy does become important. It promotes growth if you've got financial development, particularly in the case of financial institutions, because in general, financial markets are underdeveloped. Right, so this is again about labour markets. This is something that I spent quite a lot of time on, and it sort of resurfaced. And it's something that gained popularity, went out of fashion, and is sort of coming back in a sense because of the sort of economic inactivity problem that the UK, other places as well, but the UK in particular has. So the idea here, so flexicurity is just a made-up word. It comes from sort of flexible labour market, but then security as well. So the sort of importance of the two. So basically what this means, a flexible labour market means just what it says really. It needs to be flexible. So a low EPL, this is employment protection legislation. So this is how easy is it to actually fire people. So i.e. the argument being, if it's relatively easy to fire people, firms might be more willing to hire because they know there's a sort of get out. If it's very difficult to fire people, they might think twice. And then the security is, you know, what are the sort of social provisions for people that don't have a job? Is that unemployment insurance? And then what comes into this, again with security, what policies do countries have in place to get people back into work if they lose their jobs? And, you know, what are your educational policies? So if you go back to Boris Johnson, he talked about lifelong learning. So things like that and welfare support. Right, so the first thing I did with this, I looked at what happened after the financial crash, and there was some evidence that countries that did have these flexible labour markets with security, mainly Scandinavian ones, Denmark and Netherlands were the two big examples, it did actually promote growth. And what they found in particular was it was things like lifelong learning, labour market activation policies, and financial support that were the most important. And the reason this is sort of resurfaced, if you like, is that growth is one of the Labour's top priorities because we're doing very badly. And also there's much talk about inactivity and how, and they're talking about should they be cutting benefits, etc., etc. So it is something, and it was actually on the radio the other week. So in terms of what the problem is, the economic activity, and this is basically people that are neither working nor are they looking for work. So it's a sort of problem for lots of countries. And if you look at the inactivity rate, this is the actual rate that changes on the next graph. We're sort of mid-table. It's not too bad. The Italians, they're the laziest. So it's okay. Netherlands down at 14%. But the thing that worries governments is that if you look at the change, then whereas other countries are either doing nothing like Switzerland or inactivity is going down, ours is going up. Now, most countries did experience this sort of boost in inactivity post-pandemic because quite a lot of people, particularly older workers, they decided they weren't going back to work. So they did their sums, worked out, they got enough retirement income and so left the labour market. Now, in a lot of countries, and to extent in the UK, some people reversed their decision when energy prices went through the roof. Because it's all very well, not having to go to work, but not having to go to work and be freezing cold isn't actually quite as attractive. So whereas these trends have tended to reverse, in the UK, there is a problem. And, there's lots of young people that aren't in employment, they're not in education or training. So the government wants to do something about it. So the lessons that they're looking at is basically you need to incentivize employers to actually stop people from leaving and making them want to stay. So the Netherlands has got, a big health and retention scheme for workers. I think Lancaster, we've got our little employee assistance program cards. Has anybody ever run them? Well, we do have one. So quite what that gives us, I don't know. But the idea here is that employers have to actually nurture and look after their employees. The other thing is that they want, once people become inactive, they want to sort of nip it in the bud. They don't want them to remain in that state for a long time. So they don't want people reliant on these personal independence payments, which can be relatively generous. So they want things like proactive occupational health policies. Of course, one of the other problems in the UK, and it came about because of the pandemic, is some people have got like physical problems and the NHS waiting lists are through the roof. So if you've got a manual job, you simply might not be able to do it. So the idea is you need to balance the flexibility of labour markets with security for the workers, and you need strong alignment between governments and employers, and they want employers and the public sector to enhance workforce resilience, and also they want to take away the barriers that actually stop people getting back into work. So it's things like training, particularly because the labour market needs in the modern economy, they're changing very rapidly. Things like childcare support and reintegration programs so people don't get trapped in this inactivity. Of course, the problem with it is it all has to be paid for. Now, this is obviously only the top rate of tax, but the country that's highlighted as being, at the top of the flexicurity agenda has the highest top rate tax in Europe. So if we want some of these things, we're going to have to pay for them. Right, another thing I looked at was UK aid, and in particular, where it goes, what it's spent on. So in terms of the UK, this is essentially what we've typically spent on aid. Boris Johnson chopped it quite significantly, but it's still not an inconsiderable amount of money, but it is one of the things some people might like to target. And what I actually looked at was this notion of fungibility. And what this means is, what do people do with it when they get it? Now, if some aid comes in terms of like a physical project, so they'll say, right, we'll build you a road. So that's fine, they build a road. What happens if you give a foreign government the cash? So i.e., do they spend it on what you want them to spend it on, or do they spend it on something else? Now, sometimes when they spend it on something else, it's fine, because arguably they are in a better position to know what is needed than somebody in another country. But sometimes, or is it just, if you like, wasted on non-productive expenditure? So if you look typically at overseas aid to education, then if you give them $100, then you will tend to get a $30 increase in education expenditure. Now, I haven't done anything on this for a bit, but it is actually now quite important, because of course we now have the view from the White House. So Donald's view is, I've talked to the other nations, we want them to chip in and spend money too. And we've spent a lot, and it's a tremendous problem going on in many countries. A lot of problems going on. The United States always gets a request for money. Nobody else helps. So the thing about this, and there's something else I've done as well where this becomes relevant, is that, you know, America is a sort of dominant economy. And now America is governed by Donald Trump. And there are issues that are going to arise. And there's going to be questions for the rest of the world, how we respond. Now, in terms of Donald cutting US aid, you can see that, all right, 45% disapprove of what he's done, but it's not a clear majority, and he's actually got 35% approving. Now, it's you know, we're a long way from a lot of these countries, and I think one of the things we need to remember is that this aid actually does go to some of the people that do really need it. And this is just an estimate, but I think they'll be fairly accurate. And this is what they're reckoning is going to happen if there's a withdrawal of US aid. And this is, you know, on child health. So, you know, you've got 142,000 more children are going to die of diarrhea, 168,000 from malnutrition, and 185 from pneumonia. So taking away that money is going to have catastrophic effects in some of the poorest countries in the world. Right, I think this is possibly the final thing that I was going to tell you about, and this is NATO. So this actually started because I did some consultancy work with Amanda, one of our previous PhD students, and it was basically looking at some new possible members in Eastern Europe, one of them being Montenegro, and, you know, why or would they join? What did they want to join? What were their views? And the argument for doing this is particularly over recent times. Now, it might have reversed over the past 3 years, but at the time, certain countries were more leaning back towards Russia than they were to the West. So that's what they were trying to find out. So essentially, these are NATO members. So the dark colours are the founder members. The two newest members are Finland and Sweden. And certainly in the case of Finland, they only joined since 2022. But given what's gone on there, you can see why they wanted to join. So obviously, you know, they are very, very vulnerable. And Ukraine has actually asked to be a member. Georgia has been given a reassurance that it will be considered for membership. and Bosnia and Herzegovina has actually started the membership journey. Right now, in some ways, and this is why when we look at it from an economics perspective, it becomes quite difficult, is NATO isn't really just about what you're going to spend on defence. NATO is actually quite multifaceted. And if you look at some of these issues here, some of what you need to do or be in order to join NATO are very much the same as what you need to join the EU. So first of all, you've got to be a democracy, you've got to tolerate diversity. You've also either got to be a market economy, or at least you've got to be making progress towards a market economy. These two things are exactly the same to join the European Union. Your military forces have got to be under civilian control, and you've got to be good neighbours and respect other countries' sovereignty. And also, you've got to be working towards being compatible with NATO forces. And you can see that what NATO would like is that you should be spending 2% of your GDP on defence. Now, clearly, given what's gone on in most countries, for obvious reasons, between 2014, intervening 10 years to 2024, then it's gone up. And the country that's now the top of the tree there is Poland. Again, for obvious reasons, it's geographically very at threat, potentially, from whatever Russia decides to do. Estonia, likewise. So interestingly, when the President of the United States saying that the US pays for everything, although previously it was amongst the biggest contributors, now it is Poland is much farther ahead of it. So if you try and look at the impacts of NATO, so what this consultancy project actually wanted to do, it wanted to try and put a good convincing economic argument for why these potential members should want to join NATO. And the problem here is if you look at the journey all of these countries in Eastern Europe have taken, it's all been along a similar path. So they've looked at membership of the WTO, they've looked at membership of NATO, and they've looked at membership of the EU. And if you look at the case of like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, it more or less all happened at the same time. So how do you actually tease out the effects of one versus the other? Because there are no comparator countries that didn't do one of those actions. So it's very difficult to actually work anything out. So it's really correlation as opposed to causation. Again, there's not a lot of data because if you look at most of these macro aggregates, they're only annual. And of course, because these countries only came out of state socialism not that long ago, you don't have 50, 60 years of data. So the biggest effect of actually joining NATO economically is what it does for trade, because you're considered like a safer, more reliable trading partner. And in terms of Eastern Europe, in terms of exports, Croatia, Hungary, and Montenegro all saw strong effects, and imports grew quite significantly in Poland. Croatia and Montenegro gained insofar as their unemployment fell, but it was only the Hungarian economy that actually started growing any quicker. Investment increased in Montenegro, but the overall conclusion for NATO, which in some ways are not surprising, is that the smaller countries gained most potentially from being in NATO, and Croatia and Montenegro are the two really that were not in the EU that were looked at. So that's basically about NATO. And I'm sort of doing a bit more on that now because given what's happening it seems to be quite topical.